it's every organisation, I'm sure Incommunities have done it, and every organisation is having those kind of debates, because what's happened in terms of, as we know, funding of housing policy is you've had less and less grant over time, more and more emphasis on affordable rents, you've got a decline in the social sector, and more organizations having to rely on sales and commercial activities. Now, what I think is happening in a good proportion of the sector, even those that are merging, and I was so pleased today, I don't know if you saw, that Peabody and Family Mosaic are going to be merging. And Brendan, who's going to be their new chief executive, because Steve Howett's retiring, what was in Inside Housing was, we're doing this because we want to deliver more social housing. So I thought this is really interesting. And indeed, when you look at the L&Qs and others, what they're really saying is how do we ensure that we have the capacity, and that does mean being more commercial, but it also means delivering more affordable housing. So I think we're at a kind of an interesting point for housing organizations. So I think that's one issue. But I think most are sort of saying, what were we set up to do? What's our charitable purpose? How do we keep doing that, but recognize that actually meeting housing need might be a broader agenda as well? But different organizations will make different decisions about it. But I think you're right, housing organizations need to look at their policies. The second bit of policy that I would challenge housing organizations on is the issue about young people. And what I've been picking up, and I know we go around the country talking about it, was in the southeast actually last week, is putting in place affordability policies now that might restrict access for young people into social housing. Now, that makes good business sense if you think about the shared room rate and everything else. But is it very good policy? Is it really joined up? Because we had conversations earlier about what happens, what happens down the road. If that leads to increasing homelessness or pressures on other bits of the system, have we really come up with the right solution? So I think that was kind of what I was getting at, that it's time to sort of think about those things a bit more in the round.
Anybody else?
Well, can I just sort of follow on from what Terrie was saying there, because I think not only are the policies not working together and counterproductive, I think that organisations sometimes are, and I think that's an unfortunate consequence of the competitive arena that the government has put us in now. I remember when I first started working in supported housing, because that's what Horton Housing does, organisations were given grants and they worked together to find the best solution because it was in the common interest of all those organisations. Now, unfortunately, we're in a competitive arena. You bid for business, you get that for 3 years, then it'll be re-tendered out and somebody else is going to be bidding for it against you next time. So I think there's a real disincentive for organisations to work collaboratively together. And I think that's a real negative impact of the way we've seen things go, with the agenda of being more efficient and effective, supposedly. I think it's actually had the reverse impact.
Yeah, from crisis perspective and from working in the sector for quite a few years now. I mean, I guess the policy implications, obviously there is no surprise that homelessness has increased since 2010. I mean, it's an obvious it's an obvious result of government policy in terms of austerity and welfare reform and welfare cuts. I've said it previously that from the social sector, I think particularly for existing tenants, the innovation that's been in the sector around prevention has been fantastic to see. And it's something that certainly, I guess, that's probably the only thing I can see out of welfare reform that's been a really positive benefit. It's been really fantastic to see that providers have taken that lead. So there's teams who will go out now, they know who the tenants are, they look at income maximisation, they look at job creation, they provide digital inclusion through internet access and access to universal credit through free tablets, and all sorts of innovations have gone on within the sector. I think what personally I would like to see in the future, and I recognise that it is difficult because it's challenging because of funding restraints, but is innovation for people who aren't your tenants, but people who desperately need to be. And particularly for young people. There are shared solutions out there. Crisis have done some pilots previously around what shared housing will look like. In my neck of the woods in Newcastle, housing supply isn't the issue. There's 300 empty properties in Newcastle. A lot of those are 2 and 3 bedrooms. They are in quite nice areas, if you like, in terms of access to good transport links, access to reasonably well-paid jobs in terms of being able to sustain a tenancy. They could be converted into shared tenancies. Unfortunately, there is a real resistance to do that generally because of the perception of managing those tenancies once you have shared households. On the converse side, why is that such an issue? In the private sector it works. Okay, there's always going to be issues there. You guys have all been students, you would have shared. It can work. And I think that's where the innovation needs to come, to look outside as well as looking in.
I don't think, I disagree with the shared tenancies myself personally, because yes, it may work in the short term, can be a short term fix, and you know they can throw money into it and do a short term fix, but as like you're saying, long run, if you haven't got the houses for these then guys to then spread out into, like so if you've got a shared tenancy and you've got 4 different people in one place, that's in the future it's got to be 4 different houses, because those people are going to get married, they're going to have kids, and then suddenly you've got a house with 4 different families in a shared tenancy. It may be a short-term fix for youngsters. I disagree with it. I don't think it's a very good policy. That, and then obviously, you know, with all the cuts for the younger generations coming in, I'm sorry, but I'm a great believer in giving hope. That's not giving hope to people. I think that's taking hope away from people, your generation. So, yeah, I don't know. I think we are deceiving ourselves, to be honest with you.
Okay. Any questions?
Terrie, you picked up on about when you spoke about housing association. Well, you said housing and homelessness are very separate, and about bringing it together. And we said about housing organisations working better with charities or things like that. What sort of things do you think that we could do, if anyone, to bring together separation between homelessness and housing?
Well, it's so interesting, and I won't be telling any secrets if I talk about some of the things we've been talking about on the crisis board, but I think and you may want to come in on this as well, since you're an employee and I'm just sitting on the board, but the kinds of debates we've had is that an organization like that is trying to look holistically at the person. And a lot of what David was talking about earlier, in many cases it's someone that just comes in the door. They need advice, they need support, they need coaching, they need to be able to do artistic things, they need to be trained, they need to be, helped into employment. So the service that's offered in a lot of the Skylight centers is just that kind of service. But the issue still is access to housing. And so for a while, Crisis ran this scheme around access to the private rented sector and began to get a fair amount of expertise in working with landlords in the private rented sector. But even that's so limited. So believe it or not, this voluntary sector group is beginning to say, oh, should we be managing housing? Okay? Now John knows this, I say this all the time, wait a minute, you guys are great at all that personal stuff and thinking about the individual and supporting them. And then there are people out there that do housing management and all of that. And it just seems to me an obvious thing to come together, but I think one of the barriers to that, and I'm not saying that's the only thing, there's also development of new types of housing. Again, who's best placed to develop new types of housing? But I think one of the barriers, it goes back to who gets access. How do housing allocations and lettings work? And one of the things we've been trying to do in the Chartered Institute over the last year, because I'm very keen, is getting roundtables in different parts of the country to actually talk about those issues. Because I think what's happened is the acute pressures on the system and some of the pressures on housing organizations, if anything, have tightened up access, particularly in high demand areas. And that causes a real problem if you're an organization trying to provide those personalized services. So there's something there around where are the skills, where's the capacity, where's the experience, all that. And not duplicating. So we said, how many times do we reinvent? Someone says, oh, there's a gap here, so I'm going to do it now. Rather than saying, oh gosh, is there anyone we can work with in the area? I just think we all do it, don't we? And I just think that's what I mean when I say that we should be working closer together.
And anybody else who's coming from the panel on that?
No, I agree.
Yeah,
actually.
okay.
Yeah.
You said it. Any more questions? Oh, you think it?
One other thing I wanted to ask was what is your opinion on the private rental sector in comparison to the current situation? Do you think it's beneficial or do you think it's detrimental? Like, and then give me like sort of your thoughts around that.
And you mean for a
As
homeless
in-
person?
Yeah, as in from a homeless perspective, do
Yeah.
you feel like the private rental sector is beneficial, as in they can access that, or do you think that it's detrimental because it does help to push up prices and
Yeah.
all the other stuff? So yeah.
It was interesting because Julie made a comment about that this morning, didn't she?
Yeah.
About her experience, but
Well, from my experience, again, people who have been homeless, who may have lots of other associated problems, which is often the case with alcohol problems, referred health problems, etc. I'm not sure the private rented sector is that accessible, actually. Not in terms of decent standards anyway, because people are looking for references, they're looking for money up front, they're looking for bonds. The lack of supply means they can be picky. So increasingly they're saying, oh well, if you're claiming welfare benefits, we don't want you because there's lots of other people who are in work who we can take. So I think where the private sector that I know a lot of our clients access is the bottom of the pile, if you like. It's very poor landlords who aren't actually taking their responsibility of the landlord seriously, but people have nowhere to go. If they complain, they find themselves made homeless, so they don't complain, and I don't think local authorities have got the resources to police landlords in a way that I think would be very helpful. So
Even though local authorities have the right to police,
sure.
and this is the problem as well. So I personally think the private sector, I would not, if I was a council or a housing association or any sort of charity, I would not put a homeless person into a private sector place. One, because I personally think it's not cost effective. You know, there are cheaper options, right? You can build a house for £15,000 for a homeless person out of storage containers, right? £15,000 years worth, even if they're in there for 2 years, you're going to save yourself and the council and the actual housing sort of sector, you're going to save it millions for the amount of people. I personally think councils need to give up some land, like even if it's bloody car parks for God's sake, like, you know, build some of these places. They're really cheap. London started doing it, especially in East London. You will save the taxpayer a fortune, right? There are solutions, right? Except the problem is that councils won't go down the building route themselves, right? They'd rather outsource it to developers. Developers then are going to put their 80% on it. Then they're going to, the private market, then going to put their 80% on it. So I personally think the councils need to take control of the money they spend. Build these places, which are temporary. They can build, no lie, they can build a storage container, 1-bedroom home in less than 1 week.
Are you talking about prefab, sorry?
Basically, do you know, right, so you see the ships going across the sea,
Yeah.
and they've got these big metal boxes on.
Yeah.
That's storage containers. It's the cheapest and it's the most ecological way of building at the moment. They are sturdy. You can buy them for less than £500 used, right? If they wanted to buy them brand new, they're £5,000, and then they fit them out with fittings, put electric plumbing into them. They're insulated. They're a cheap way of building, and it's a quick solution, but they can last forever. So it's an actual, even if it's just used as a stopgap, to then so they don't have to put people in the private sector, it will make a massive difference. That's what I do.
Can I just come in on this? Because I think that one of the issues for some areas of the country, and I don't disagree with anything that's been said, and it is interesting, I've seen those containers, and I think authorities like Brighton and others have, it's quite interesting how they've turned them into, in effect, studio flats, and they stack them on top. I know, it's really quite innovative, and I think in the case of Brighton, for example, they were using it on a plot of land which wasn't clear yet how it was going to be developed, so that it was a temporary use. When I say temporary, it was probably 5 years or something. But the thing about the private rented sector, which I think is really important to recognise, that it depends on where you are in the country. And I think that, as we know, in areas of high demand like London, you really need to look overall at what accommodation and land you should have. And I agree, you know, we should be doing everything we can with public sector land and other land to build more housing. No question about that. But in the meanwhile, the pressures are pretty acute. and I think some of the local authorities, you know, are having to think about, are we placing someone in the private rented sector in Haringey, and that might even be difficult in Haringey, it might be in Barking, or are we moving someone to Stoke-on-Trent in a different sector? Those are the kind of, now that's the acute pressure, so I think there's that, and I think so sometimes the private rented sector might be the right solution, might be the suitable solution, or the best solution in the circumstances. But I do think what's really important is that the real problem with the private rented sector, as Faye was saying earlier, it's a huge contributor to homelessness because of the insecurity in the way it operates. And there are still issues about standards as well. So I think that if it's ever going to become a sector where people can feel safe and secure and stable and healthy and all that sort of stuff, then there needs to be a real drive for a professionally managed rented sector. And then there's an issue of the rent levels and the affordability.
And I think so, from the,
Yeah.
I think we said earlier around the homeless reduction bill, I think you can't argue with it in principle, but I share the same concerns as colleagues from Bradford. I used to work in local government for 10 years when I joined Crisis about a year and a half ago. And so I was there when housing options was being developed. We were homeless prevention champion. We had enhanced housing options back then, so it's strange how if you stay in the sector long enough, the same things kind of come back around again. But prevention is hard. True prevention takes time, and it takes money. If it's family mediation, you don't mediate overnight and get someone back in sustainably with their family. Relief is easy. Relief is a set of keys and a bond scheme in the low-level private rented. My last job in local government was restructuring a service to taking out 70% of the floodline funding. It's one of the main reasons why I left, because I just couldn't face doing it anymore. So the local authority I was in County Durham, that was actually probably one of the best local authorities, if you like, in terms of having a really robust front line that it couldn't take that level of hit. But when you look at what they now would need to achieve and build back up again, it's turning the clock back probably 5 or 6 years to get to the level where I would think a decent local authority could actually comply with that legislation. And I know they're saying there's money, but personally I would very much doubt if there was ever going to be enough money quickly to enable that to happen effectively. And I think it will potentially push that statutory safety net just even further away from people. It's my belief, I suppose, is that it's a policy which will help in local authorities, like you presented. So in the southeast, where the housing shortage is absolutely acute, in the north, I think it will actually make things worse for an awful lot of people. Access to social housing stock isn't necessarily the problem; it's the structural issues in this region that are the problems. Unemployment, it's affordable housing, it's a decent job. It's not bricks and mortar. And this policy, unless it's done really well and robust and the money is there, I think it can make things more worse.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that it's very different in different parts of the country, and certainly in Bradford we wouldn't be looking at containers, because actually we actually do have probably sufficient 1 or 2 bedroom flats. Part of what we find where we struggle is sometimes when it's families and people need sort of family homes, and then that becomes a bit probably more problematic. But it's not just the home, it's about prevention, and it's no good giving somebody a home if there isn't any furniture, and I have to say we found sometimes we have given somebody a 1 bedroom flat and we've gone in and they're just on the floorboards with a sleeping bag. And so, what we're saying as a housing association is, well, we've got to recognise that. So and lots of associations are looking at preventative measures and how you can sustain somebody's tenancy, and that's about trying to find furniture for people and trying to do financial inclusion and budgeting and looking at heating, and I think it's all about, for us, I think particularly in Bradford, it's about keeping people in those homes, because sometimes it gets too much, so you can get them a roof over their head, but if nothing else is working for them, they'll leave it of their own accord. So there are some differences, but there are still some big issues on Paul, that are different.
Because I think for it to be a home for someone, it has to be where they want to live,
Yes.
and not just putting a roof over their
Yes.
head. If they actually want to live somewhere else in a different type, it's not going to be sustainable. People are going to move on, and so you've not really solved the problem by just allocating them property, I think.
And we've found that in some of the turnover that we've had, where we've got, we've managed to give somebody a roof over the head, but you've got to have everything else with it. And
Well,
that's
yeah, I
sustainable.
agree. You need to bring, not, you've got to bring everything into it. You need to bring big businesses into it. You need to have big businesses, the ones who decide to base it in London, move them out and get them up to places where there's housing stock. There is places in this country. There's 650,000 empty homes,
Yes.
for God's sake.
Mm.
It's just the businesses aren't going to those areas where the houses are.
Yes.
Where if they do move there, like if Facebook moved, say, like, I don't know where up there, like Middlesbrough or something, where there's loads of like empty housing, if Facebook moved there, people will go there to work. Because they want to go for those big businesses, they want to work with them.
Perhaps government could start by doing a bit more of that as well.
Yeah, that's totally right. Well,
Yeah.
what I'm going to do
Trust me,
now,
London, get out of London.
I'm conscious of the time, and I was told that we needed to finish the session by 22 to move on to the next one. And